we will do well with that for the time being anyway. You realize, at least in my style, don't hesitate asking questions anytime. I don't mind that. If I need to just delay the question a little bit because we're going to be dealing with it a little later, I will just attend to that. But I want to be responsive to your questions, your queries, your confusions, if that may be the result of what I say. Let's just take the sheet for the moment. This first session is going to be introductory in some sense. It's also going to be a bit comparative. And the reason for that is some of this material is going to be quite foreign to many of us. And that may mean if we can relate it to something we're more familiar with, and then in a comparative way think about Islam and the Qur'an, it might be helpful. So this first session will sort of approach some of those things. I'd like to begin this morning with the title. A Christian thinks about Islam and the Qur'an. You probably, most of you are not familiar with the distinction I'm about to give you, but social scientists, anthropologists, for example, often use the distinction between emic and etic. Emic is thinking about something, speaking about something, learning about something from the inside of the group. Etic is just the opposite. Speaking about, thinking about, learning about something from the outside. Not as an insider, but as an outsider. So we could talk about Christianity, and we individually may know more or less about Christianity, but insofar as we are practicing Christians, we operate in an emic way. Yeah, I'm going to do that here. Just the distinction between insiders and outsiders as we think about things.
Are those two pieces of words that you put at the end of the word?
Are they suffixes like academic?
I'm not sure about that. Etymologically, I don't want to get everybody confused. Let's just think about insiders and outsiders. The distinction, okay? Now, in other words, for this class, I want to self-identify. I'm an insider to Christianity, but I'm an outsider to Islam, socially. In this highly pluralistic world in which we live, it is important, I say, and I argue, that people in various religious communities remain open to and learn about their interfaith neighbors. Each Sunday in worship, we at St. Andrew pray for our interfaith partners. Among them are Jewish and Islamic communities, both of which, along with Christianity, are prime examples of the great monotheistic religions of the Middle East. Now, there are all sorts of subsets out there in the Middle East as well, but these would be the prime examples. This course will focus on one of those partners, Islam. We do this as respectful outsiders to Islam and with appreciation for the contributions our Muslim neighbors make to us and our community. The approach to the topic will be comparative, as I said earlier, in order that we might understand how Islam and Christianity and or Judaism are similar or different and how we might learn from each other. I'm going to give you 3 contemporary examples. Regarding the urgency of this issue. Some of you may be aware that we, Julie and I, that is, spent much of the month of October in Peru. We were traveling in a group, a very small group actually. There happened to be a gentleman in that group, a retired Army officer, graduate of West Point, roughly our age, in other words, plenty of gray hair. One morning, and I was not present, but she was, he teed off on Islam and Muslims. He is a practicing Roman Catholic, but he went off on how they worship a different God than we do. Sitting next to Julie, a practicing Christian, was a Jewish woman from Washington, D.C. She could be more accurate than I, but the Jewish woman came unglued. Now, from my point of view, probably justifiably so. She later talked to me about this because we had spent a week together, and I think we had confidence in each other. That's just a contemporary example, and what he was referring to was a document he saw from somebody who had taken Islam to task up one side and down the other and footnoted it all. He thought that justified it as scholarship. I could give you a bushel full of those places and go out there, things, and go out there on the internet and find another bushel or 2 of them. They're not scholarship in most cases. They are a conclusion that is then brought back and attempted to substantiate. You could do the same thing with Christianity and probably to a lesser degree with Judaism as well.
This woman came on because she disagreed?
Disagreed. She disagreed. And she was quite outspoken about it. The second episode is Julie and I have had some Palestinian friends, for 25, 30 years. Just before Christmas, they were in this country visiting their son in Seattle. And we know Michael and Carmen very well. After we got there and there were greetings and we had a meal and we had all of those things caught up, he almost died from COVID, so we heard that difficult story. And then I could see him sitting over in the corner scrolling through his phone, and he wanted to make sure I saw a couple of people speaking in Arabic, which I don't speak, but he was translating, and they were former Muslims taking Islam to task yet again. Coming from this gentleman, I was not surprised. We have had differences of view about that over the years. And coming from where he does in Bethlehem, these issues are highly politicized. Everything in that part of the world is political, including the side of the bed you get up on the morning, or where you choose to eat, what you choose to eat, which language when you walk into a store you lead with. You know, it's great to be monolingual like some of us. You know, we can walk in and you get one thing. We could get by speaking English, others may not. Now, getting very current, this morning, I always, this morning, as most mornings, I scroll through the headlines of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I can't remember which one. It was one of the two. There was a headline about a professor of art history, at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. It's kind of one of the many sister private institutions of the one I taught at in Minnesota. And she had shown a piece of artwork, artistic work representing Muhammad. And the Muslim students in the class took offense. Now, I didn't take time to read the whole article, but I think, from what I gathered, she was dismissed. Okay. Two different worlds collide. She justified her action based upon this as a piece of art that was classic in some sense for her. They saw it as a representation, which Muslims are not supposed to do. And many of us are old enough to remember the cartoons in Denmark some time ago. Okay. It's one thing to knowingly stumble into some of these controversies, but it's something different to just stumble into them unaware. So I think this issue is important for us to consider, and I position myself here, first of all, as an outsider, empathetic, well-intentioned, and so on, to the subject at hand. Larry.
A question on your West Point graduate and Army officer. I presume you did not learn that at West Point.
I would assume that as well, but I have a hunch, and this is a hunch, he was part of a culture where that churned away.
In the Army. Yes.
Well, this Jewish woman confided in, she's from Alexandria, Virginia, and she worked for the agricultural department for her whole career as an economist, and she lives around many retired government workers, including military workers, and she said, I know the story. Now, I'm not trying to be judgmental here. I'm trying to represent values about how we think and how we speak about interreligious, interfaith communities and partners. And there are plenty of folks who are inclined to look at the sordid history of the Catholic Church, Protestantism, Christianity. And I think, from my point of view, we want to deal with that historically in a responsible way and not in a defensive way. But we want to stand on values that we hold dear today, which are ecumenical, which are, I think, values that take diversity very seriously, and hopefully respectfully. So, okay. If you look down that outline, you will see what I have not done. I have not taken the next 5 today and the next 4 Sundays and broken them down day by day. I have simply provided an outline. And the reason for that is I am not sure how quickly we're going to move through this. And better than getting off day, it seems we can simply follow this through and think about some of the things that are listed here in this outline. If you turn over to the back of page 1, you will see where that outline goes. We'll move through today more quickly through the front part of this than will happen after that. Then there are some resources. Some of you are readers and are interested in this. And these kinds of things might be helpful to you. I know, Larry, you asked me about this some time ago, and I held you off a little bit because it was going to be here. Only if you don't have to read these to get something out of the next, hopefully out of the next weeks. But if you are interested, you can follow this through. Okay? And then if you want to turn to the back of the second page, Carol was so kind and generous to put some colored pictures in here for me. Some of you have probably traveled to Istanbul and visited the Blue Mosque, perched above the Bosporus there. You don't have to be Muslim. You don't have to be Muslim to just appreciate the sheer architectural, artistic beauty of that place. The second one is simply an overview pulled off the internet of Mecca. And the bottom one we'll talk a little bit more about later on. It's more of a close-up of the Kaaba in Mecca. We all know that Mecca is rather important to Muslims, as is Jerusalem for different reasons. But all of that is sort of graphically represented in these pictures. Some of you may be interested in just foraging around on the internet to find all sorts of other pictures of mosques and historical sites and so on. Okay. Later on today, we will come to the first side of the second page, but let's not do that right away. Okay? Any questions, concerns, observations? Yes.
When we talk about Islam and Muslim, is Muslim like a nationality and Islam is the religion?
I'm gonna get there in just a second. Okay, yeah. That is a good question, but it is also a kind of grammatical question. Most of the terms that I will use are probably transliterated into Latin characters, and if they're not, they're clearly not in Arabic characters. I think what I will do today too is just pass this around. Here's a copy I have of the Qur'an. And the reason this is interesting is you can see on one side the text in English and on the other side in Arabic. It gives you a graphic look at this, I think, here. So India will start it over here. It'll get around. And just have that visual, if you will. Now, the Arabic word Islam refers to submission or surrender to God's will. And the term Muslim simply means one who submits or surrenders to God's will. And obviously, they are linked to what we today refer to as the religion of Islam, comprising over 1 billion of the earth's inhabitants. It's hard to know exactly. There are just a lot of Christians and a lot of Muslims. And some other religions too. So I think that the short answer is these two words, Islam in Arabic and Muslim, are grammatically closely related. Historically, the prophet, Muhammad, appeared in the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. As Judaism and Christianity before it, Islam became a diverse and complex religious phenomena. Though born in the Arabian Peninsula, it has spread beyond the Arab world. Much of South and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the West, or what we call the West as well. Europe, North America. Between the years 610 of the Common Era to 632, Muhammad received a series of revelations. Those revelations were from Allah, literally the God. Through the angel Gabriel, and they're called recitation. Qur'an. They're revelations, recitations of the word from Allah. The words. Strictly speaking, and I emphasize, strictly speaking, and we'll learn more about this in a bit, only the Arabic could be considered Quran. Even though the text has been translated into English, many other world languages as well, it is simply oral recitation in the beginning. It's simply an oral recitation in the beginning in Arabic. Following Muhammad's death, an authoritative written text was produced. And we'll learn a bit more about that. As such, however, Quran is considered to be the ultimate revelation of God. More specifically, it is the revelatory centerpiece of Islam. And it displays and actualizes for Muslims the inbreaking of divine revelation. To use the language of religious systems, it represents the foundation without which that religious system could not function. And that revelation is what gives Islam its coherence. Now, you're probably familiar with these, the 5 pillars that define the practice of Muslims are up here. The Shahada, You'll see it translated in different ways. That is the statement of faith. I bear witness that there is no God but God. And I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger or prophet of God. Then, salat, prayer 5 times a day for observant Muslims. And if you've spent much time in a predominantly Muslim country, the calls to prayer are conspicuous and obvious, and to those who aren't inclined, sort of disruptive, early in the morning especially. Zakat, charitable giving. Sawam, fasting during the month of Ramadan, and the Hajj to Mecca. And that's what you see in those pictures. You see the perambulation around the Kaaba in the Mecca square. Now, what you can see when you think about this right away, and it's foundational, is that Islam is a religion with a powerfully concise confession of faith, the Shahada. And at the same time, it turns significantly on the practice of submission to Allah through clearly prescribed activities. The other 4. Emanating from Moses came the Torah for Judaism. Now, both Torah and, shall we say, Sharia law, in the case of Islam, presume that obedience is necessary. Obedience to the will of God is necessary. Fundamentally important. Now, the term ummah refers to the Muslim community. We, for Christians, we have a community called church in the broadest sense of that term. Jews, especially practicing Jews, refer to the people of Israel, synagogue communities, and so on and so forth. But Islam has this term, and it expresses the basic unity of the Islamic community. A community made up of Muslims from different regions of the world and different ethnic groups. Here, the Ummah is very diverse when you look at it globally. And, of course, the great historic division is between the Shia and the Sunni. We're going to talk more about those later, but the Shia and the Sunni. We think of Iran when we think of the Shiites. In the grand scheme of things, they are a minority compared to the Sunni. We'll talk more about them later on. But the Middle East, even where let's say the Sunni predominate, will have significant minority communities of Shiites. Now, think about this for a moment. At our worship service today, every Sunday, we make a confession of faith. It may be the Apostles' Creed, it may be the Nicene Creed. It's a confession of faith. They were constructed in early Christianity to represent the faith of the church. Through the history, most Christian denominations have held on to those great confessions of faith. What I'm suggesting is that the notion of faith figures, or belief, let's put it that way, correct belief, if you want to talk about it in orthodox terms, that faith somehow represents Christianity. Now, that does not mean that Christians don't practice things. Think about Judaism. What's at the center of Judaism? Among other things, Torah. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, encounters God, and comes down with Torah, the commandments. And then all the other parts of Torah, ritual and ceremonial law, civic law, and so on and so forth, that govern the practice of Jews, those who are observant. If you took Torah out of Judaism, it wouldn't make much sense, I think. Just as if you took Christ out of Christianity, it wouldn't make much sense. In Islam, if you took the Qur'an out of the system, it wouldn't make much sense. And the relative, and in here I'm going out on a bit of a limb, but the relative distinction here is one confession, very concise, straightforward, and 4 prescribed activities. Does that give us a sense of balance here? Perhaps. Now, I am going to have you turn now to the first page of the first side of the second page. Some of you may have seen this before, but I think it's helpful to have in diagrammatic form some way of thinking about these 3 religions comparatively as a way of illustrating Islam. These 3 religions all are dealing in some sense with the inbreaking of the transcendent into the mundane, into the earthly. Now, just as an aside, from probably the 17th, 18th centuries in the West and on, with the Enlightenment, the turn to rationality and modern notions of science and so on and so forth, there are those who don't think these two, the transcendent and the earthly, ever interact, or there probably isn't anything beyond the mundane realm. But for these religions, there is this inbreaking from the transcendent into the earthly. Judaism, there are several names for God, Yahweh. We refer to God. Muslims, Allah. And you see the arrows going down. The mountain of God, Sinai, commandments. And from the earthly side, Moses goes up on that mountain. Have any of you ever hiked up what is considered to be Mount Sinai today to see the sunrise? It is a moving experience, whether you're a believer or not. It's a pilgrimage site for people from all over the world walking or riding camels, singing hymns in their own language, and you're kind of in among the camels and all that, and you get up there, and the sun rises over some of the most desolate terrain you've ever seen. It's very moving. Now look at the middle column. We have just come through Advent and the Christmas season. God, in the structure of this, breaks into the world in the figure of Jesus Christ. Born in a manger. Probably not a wooden stable, but in a cave. If you go to Bethlehem, you can see where those may have been. And Mary, an earthly woman, representing the mundane reality of earth, Jesus is considered true God, true man. And it's represented in this highly vivid imagery of a virginal conception. You take that out of the Christian meta-narrative and it doesn't make much sense. Revelations, Qur'an, a series of them over a couple of decades. And Muhammad goes into the wilderness and receives those recitations. Islam. So what I'm hoping you can see here is that there is a kind of structural character to all three of these religions, even though the particulars are different. They do emerge out of a kind of, and I speak metaphorically here, common soil of that part of the world. Now, we've got to be a little bit careful because this is easily confused. Okay, we know that in 610, Muhammad ibn Allah, living in Mecca, often went out into the hills outside the city on retreat. This was not the first time. He had done this other times. On then one of these retreats, he heard a voice that commanded, Iqra, meaning to recite, read aloud, and taken aback, he's not sure what he's supposed to, who this is, or what he's supposed to read, or what he's supposed to hear. And the voice said, read that which is written on your heart, okay? He's terrified, he's confused. He goes back into the city to his wife, thinking he may have lost it. And she says, you should listen. So, Muslims come to believe that Quran was passed inerrantly from the lips of Muhammad to the page of the text. To be sure, then, as I've said, Quran is central. Now, here's where we've got to be somewhat careful. At first glance, or at first jump, we might think that Jesus and Muhammad are parallels. But if you look at the diagram, they're not really. Muhammad is a prophet, but not God. While Christians worship Jesus, Muslims believe worship of a man is idolatrous. Any human. So you see, if you look at this diagram, the human figure, Jesus Christ, is at the point where heaven and earth come together for Christians. Muhammad is down here for Islam. Continuing on. Christians accord very high value, status to the Bible. That's true. But it is the work of many, many hands. If you just take what we call the Old Testament, or what Jews call Tanakh, it probably, through the oral tradition and written tradition, emerged over a period of 1,000 years, or the better part of a millennium. It's a different state of affairs. Now, there are modern debates in Christianity about how we understand Scripture. There are those who are literalists. Most of us, in effect, are not literalists, whether we claim to be or not. Much of this is figurative language describing the character of the Jewish or Christian narrative. There's a history to the Jewish and Christian Bible. Much of it is narrative, in addition to a lot of other genres, poetry, legal material, and so on and so forth. You can just mark that for a second. But the Bible is the human vehicle through which Christians think the figure of Christ comes to us. It's the vehicle. We don't worship the Bible, most of us. It's was it Luther? Terry, you can correct me here. Luther, I think, said, or is reported to have said, the Bible is the manger that brings the Christ child to us. Now, it's the vehicle then. It's not the object of our devotion. Jesus is to Christians as the Qur'an is to Muslims. As Muhammad is to Muslims, so is the Bible to Christians, the vehicle. Christians seek to know God through Jesus as recorded through the vehicle of the Bible, whereas Muslims seek to know God through the Qur'an as told through the vehicle of Muhammad. So, if I'm correct, that the backdrop, the structural backdrop, has some comparative similarities between the three religions, the particulars have to be kept straight and not confused. We tend to say, oh, Jesus is a man, Muhammad is a man, they must have something together. In the structure of things, they must be similar. Well, not quite so hastily. Now, again, I'm mindful of the time here. Carol, tell me, guide me here. Under our normal schedule, we had about 45 minutes, maybe 50.
I think you have a little bit more flexibility if you'd like to go.
Well, I don't want to.
We promised people that they would be able to go home by noon.
Okay. Leave from the church by noon. Yeah, you see, I go home and I don't get much encouragement. No, that's not true. That's not true. But I think what I'd like to do, I might have a few more remarks, but if I can make this doggone thing work here. I want to illustrate the distinction between a text and a recitation. In Arabic, It's as loud as I can make it.
الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العظيم.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. Praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy. Master of the day of judgment, it is you we worship, it is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, those who incur no anger, those who have not gone astray. And thus, questions surely arise.
You don't have to understand the Arabic to appreciate the beauty of the recitation. And sometimes, depending on where you are, the call to prayer, which is probably recorded now, can maintain that beauty even to those of us outside the tradition and who do not understand Arabic. It is also this sense that there is a divide between the way the word or words function when you are thinking about them as oral words as opposed to written words. And for those of us who are Christian, I think it is helpful to think about much of the Bible, much of the Old Testament emerged in an oral environment. People who could read and write were few and far between. They were most often probably scribal figures. Now you and I live in a textual world, a literary world, but we also live in an audio-visual world now. And you don't have to go back too many decades, and you couldn't get the Bible in an audio-visual medium, but you can now. So that notion of how word or words function is, in many ways, governed by the medium that's available to us. And those of us who were in college, kind of when many of us were, remember Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Maybe. It certainly affects the message. So, Larry.
What dialect is there?
Say again?
What dialect? Is there a particular dialect?
There may be. I'm not familiar with it, and my ear, not knowing the language, I'm sure there are dialects. After 9/11, we at Concordia and the institution itself in Minnesota realized, and we've been teaching about Islam for a long time, but we realized we probably had to have a Muslim teaching Islam. And we hired a delightful gentleman. Intelligent, humane. He dressed the part. He was an American citizen, but had come from Pakistan. I can remember, I don't know if Julie can remember this, we went to pick him up for some reason at the airport to bring him back to campus. And I don't remember the circumstances, but it was right on the way home. It was right over the prayer time, and he started praying in the back seat. At least we had enough sense to just be quiet and listen. It is beautiful. Okay. Steve.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment. You mentioned the prayers, the second pillar of Islam, praying 5 times a day. I think that's something that maybe Christians can learn. Right?
Yeah.
Because in Christianity, the reason that Christians need God's mercy is original sin, right? But in Islam, the reason that humans need God's mercy is forgetfulness.
Yeah.
Because in day-to-day living, we forget about God. And so Muslims pray 5 times a day so that they're never far away from remembering God.
I think that's a good point, Steve. I think that's a good point. And just a second, Gretchen, I think, I remember at our local church in Minnesota, we had a gentleman who was a white American, born and bred, but had converted to Islam because he felt like there was something to do. Now, I think there is plenty to do in Christianity too, but in a very different sense. But I agree with you. And now here, I think, is something that we can learn, and I just state it maybe as an extension to what you're saying. It's a tough job, I think, with young people or anybody else to work to get them to accept belief and the faith and then work back to practice. I think it works better the other way around. You do the practice and the head follows. That's a proposition, Gretchen.
I was wondering how similar the 5 times a day prayer is to monastic tradition of Baptist and complex.
You see, there are traditions in Christianity that follow the hours, so to speak. The hours. And I think that's exactly right, again, in terms of practice. But, and I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I'll do it anyway. Protestants, the notion of faith, belief, and believing the right things. Churches will divide over what the Orthodox faith belief is. They may not divide over how you practice your religion, but they will divide. Now, I think it's important for those of us in the Lutheran tradition and other Protestant traditions to realize that the Greek word pistis, faith, or to believe, is not just a head thing. Read Mark's gospel and the other gospels, it's a following thing. Following Christ, and I think Mark is a primo example of that in the New Testament. You follow the way of Christ. And that isn't just figuring out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin or a needle or something. Needles don't have heads, do they? But it is. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the way our theology functions, the way our belief is articulated is critically important. If for no other reason, then we can do some really come up with some really cockeyed ideas that have very negative consequences in human activity and human actions if we're not careful. Now, I think there are positive reasons why theology is important too, but it's not just do we have it all faithfully thought out and held too dearly in our heads. Does that make any sense to you? Okay. Next week, we're going to come back to this, and I'm going to get to the part of, I guess it's on the first page, side 1, probably D, and we'll go on to E. Okay? You're welcome to take them. If you can think about it, bring them back if you remember. But maybe, Carol, we can produce a few more, so I'll have some extras if it doesn't turn out that way.